We've got one final talk before I let you all go for your afternoon and your weekend. Pleased to welcome Alex Weinert from Microsoft. I've gotten to know Alex over the last few years. He's the director of identity security at Microsoft, and he's going to be talking, as you can see from the title slide that just came up, in part about SolarGate, the SolarWinds incident. And Alex, I'll just flag, if you weren't with us this morning, we started the morning with Congressman John Katko, the ranking Republican on the House Homeland Security Committee, had a good discussion around the SolarWinds APT as an identity attack. Later, John Miller at ITI, I'm going to quote him. He said, characterizing SolarWinds as an identity attack presents an opportunity to remind policymakers of how fundamental identity is to not only what we're doing online as consumers, but to enterprise environments. So we've sort of been foreshadowing your appearance all day, but now I'll step back and let you jump in, and look forward to talking more with you at the end of the discussion. Thanks again for joining us.
All right, thanks a lot, Jeremy. And I will try to leave a little room for discussion at the end. I have a fair chunk to cover. So I'm the director of identity security for Microsoft. Sort of the punchline is I'm responsible, my team and I are responsible for preventing unauthorized access and fraud in all the accounts at Microsoft, whether consumer things like Xbox or enterprise things like Office 365, or many customers use Azure Active Directory as their sort of single sign-on solution. And so it gives access to all downstream applications. I'm going to talk about SolarGate in terms of an attack on the roots of trust. There's a lot of interesting correlations here. The other thing I want to talk about in context is something called zero trust, which is an approach to sort of proactive security that was really born out of the era of time where folks were relying over much on their on-premises infrastructure. And so the idea was, I'm not going to worry about any requests that come from my network. They must be fine. The thing I'm going to worry about is stuff that's coming from outside the wall. And so the idea was, I'm going to set up my network as a sort of M&M, right? It's going to be a hard, crunchy exterior with a soft, chewy center. And attackers very quickly figured out how to penetrate those environments. As well as we had more and more, with connectivity growing through, Wi-Fi networks and personal devices and mobile devices, the perimeter kept moving outwards. And so this concept of, in zero trust, we want to assume that there's no benefit given to a request that's coming from inside your network, right? That we need to verify those in the same way we would verify something from outside. Another way to think about zero trust, and kind of colloquially, is like, imagine you're camping in bear country. If you're camping in bear country, you give more thought to how you set up your camp, right? So zero trust is in some sense about proactive security. And, the principles that we ask customers to think about as we go into this are to make sure you're explicitly verifying every aspect of a request, that you're, making sure that you apply least privilege access principles so that people have as few permissions as possible, the minimum permissions they need to do the task at hand. So for example, if there's a task that should only be happening from within the corporate office during business hours by a certain person on a certain class of device, you would encode that into the rules for access for the resource. And then assuming breach, importantly, kind of goes down this assumption that bad things can happen and will happen, and that, you'll need great telemetry and response techniques and automation to help you deal with that. At a very mechanical level, we can think about every access request as passing, in the digital world, as passing through sort of these phases, right? You have some entity, whether a human or a machine, like a service account, that is trying to get to a resource so that it can be productive. And to do that, it has to pass through some kind of a device and over some sort of network pathway to get to the resource on the other side. And then resources could be on premises, in the cloud. It could be a VM. It could be a SQL database, whatever. But, the basic paradigm holds. And the zero trust, basically says that you want to put policy around all that so that you can assert the context of every request. That's your explicitly verify part. And then apply controls like, anything from restricting downloads to requiring MFA to blocking access altogether. And then around all of that, you want to frame that with intelligence and automation that allows you to respond quickly. So that's sort of zero trust in a couple of minutes. When we think about the scope of it, it's quite broad. right? And even if you were looking at this outside of the context of an attack as a CISO, you'd kind of be, you might reasonably be daunted by the amount of stuff that's here. But the principles apply very broadly, and we encourage people to apply them very broadly, not just us, but the industry as a whole. So one of the things around zero trust is this, this thing that people like to say, never trust, always verify. And so if the list of things before was daunting, that list didn't include things like, well, wait a minute, who sold you that software? And how did they build their software? And how did they verify that those builds weren't tampered with? And who sold them the software signing software? And how was that software built? And what machine was it run on? And who was in the supply chain for that machine? And so on and so on and so on. So this concept of like never trusting all the way out to the root of trust is really, really hard. Like we should recognize that for the average organization, even for the best organizations, it's minimally daunting, right? So this never trust, always verify is tricky because at some level, society runs on trust, right? In fact, Microsoft, we have a common saying, which is Microsoft runs on trust, which is mostly about compliance stuff. But when we say like trust is an important part of how we do our work, if you were truly not trusting of anything in your ecosystem, you would have a very difficult, time getting through your day. And identity in a fundamental way runs on trust. When we look at the standards that identity is built on, it is very often built on the concept of there is a root of trust in a cryptographic secret somewhere that is used as the thing that if this thing is present, we will trust it. And for that reason, ever since these protocols and standards were introduced, we've always said, look, it's really important to protect the key. Some of these things we've moved from a place where we say, that root of trust is now required to be in hardware. So FIDO, for example, we moved the root of trust to hardware. But as we go down looking at things like SAML or OAuth, we have these places where we say the root of trust is really important. That the identity system works in some sense because we get to a place where we can say, look, as long as you're carrying a token from that person over there that I trust, as long as you're introduced to me by somebody I trust, I'll trust you. Right. So we'll pick on Jeremy here for a second. Pam said, hey, you should speak at this conference. This was actually a couple years ago, the first time I did this. Jeremy's a great person. You should talk to Jeremy. I trusted Jeremy because Pam introduced us, right? That's how identity works. It works on an introduction mechanism. I didn't have to go independently verify all that. I trusted Pam. She introduced me to Jeremy. So in that world, right, that root of trust is super important. If somebody can impersonate the introducer successfully enough, then we can get into trouble. So we'll see that in a minute. Trust is under attack. We have a systemic, approach by a set of actors on attacking the roots of trust. And we've seen that actually in society, right? We've seen a systemic attack on the roots of trust in society. And we've seen sort of, dire consequences coming out of those attacks on the roots of trust. The thing that happens when we break down trust, again, is that it becomes very, very hard to operate day to day in a reasonable way, right? We rely on rituals and trust and vouching and norms to establish our trust. And with that trust, we can operate well. And without it, we start to degrade pretty rapidly. So, Soloragate really was a fundamental attack on trust. Right. And what we saw was the attack on trust relationships was an incredibly effective way, moving up to the roots of trust for the system and compromising those roots of trust was a very effective way for this actor to compromise some of the most effective and advanced security organizations in the world. I mean, we should be very clear that the average shop, the person who runs a restaurant chain or retail outlet or a law firm, if folks that are charged with cybersecurity infrastructure for the nation, right, or folks that are the leading firms in the world in terms of cybersecurity detection and research are compromised by this actor and not detected, right, that's an incredibly effective attack and a very worrisome one. So if we kind of go forward from here and we say, all right, so Soloragate, let's think of that. That was an attack on trust relationships, right? It was an attack on the trust we have in our vendors and our contractors. the users and the integrity of their authentication, in the hardware that they use, and on-premises infrastructure, on the applications that are doing business on our behalf in our infrastructure. So one of the common things was to attack the trust that we have in things like mail archival or mail classification, or even mail security applications. So we've seen vendors that were compromised from all of those categories. And we also saw custom software from the companies that was compromised in all those categories. The SolarGate actor attacked the roots of trust in our ecosystems, in our identity ecosystems. And those roots of trust are important in identity, right? Without those roots of trust, we have a very difficult, situation. So when we look at SolarGate in terms of the attack, what sectors it attacked, right? SolarGate was really an attack on the government, but it went through a lot of IT. There was a lot of IT compromised. In fact, there was more information technology compromised than any other single sector. So why is that? Like, why is that if my actor was attempting to get access to government secrets, that they're spending so much time getting to IT? And the reason is that that's where the trust is. If I'm an attacker and I want to get into an environment, I have to establish residence, I have to establish permanence, and then I can act on my target. And this attacker did all those things, right? They went after SolarWinds because SolarWinds has a pervasive admin level footprint in many, many on-prem environments all around the world. So by turning SolarWinds, that trusted software, the most trusted software, right? In some sense, because all of these companies said, yes, SolarWinds, you can run my devices, you can run my network infrastructure, you can manage my logs, you have full privileges in my environment, right? And then they took that trust and they subverted it. And they used it as a way to get into these environments. I trust my security vendors to have the detection software that will spot the malware and spot the attack patterns. So of course the attacker goes after those vendors. In fact, using in some cases the infrastructure that we talked about before, they go after the security vendors so that they understand how the vendors are detecting their attacks, so they can subvert those detections, right? By stealing the tools that are used to do the detection, you're able to then make sure that you don't get detected, right? So that establishes a durable residence inside the organization's network. And then, why do they go after the United States government? You can speculate on that one. But if this actor in all ways looks to us like an advanced persistent threat actor consistent with nation state activity. And I think we're pausing there in terms of our attribution. So, all right, let's look at SolarGate in depth. I'm delighted to be talking to a bunch of identity hacks, so maybe this stuff will be easy peasy for you. But going quickly into SolarGate in depth, basically what happened in SolarGate in the initial attacks, it looked to us like this, which was that we were seeing tokens that were being presented to Azure Active Directory that looked weird. They had weird lifespans. They had weird, token issuance attributes. Some of the claims in the tokens were unusual. And so when we look at that and we say, okay, there's a token that we don't think was issued by a legitimate SAML IDP, we believe that's a forged token. So at this point, we're like, all right, somebody's getting the key material from this, from these SAML instances. We didn't know how yet. We just knew that. We knew that the key material is being exfiltrated. Now we know that there's lots of ways to capture an on-premises identity environment. So taking over an on-premises network is not novel art, it's known art. But when we looked at it, we thought, all right, we know that we have a forgery here. So there's, this is the main way that this would happen. In a few cases, we saw that actually new trust relationships were being established in the cloud. So people were saying to Azure Active Directory under a global admin's privilege, hey, you should now trust this here cert. But in most cases, what we were seeing was that an existing cert that had already been established was being abused. So we knew the actor was exfiltrating a certificate, a signing certificate, and then using that to forge tokens to Azure Active Directory. Now, the harm in that was that they could forge a token at any level of trust for any user. So what they would do is they would forge a token for the global admin for the environment or for a similarly privileged user for the environment, and then use that to establish another false trust, a compromised trust again. And in this case, what they would do is they would take an existing application And so your mail archival app, your mail classification app, your mail protection app that had permissions to read mail. And then they would use their privileges in Azure Active Directory to add trust so that they could log in as though they were that application and then read the mail APIs under the guise of being that application. It's just like stealing a password, right? They were essentially stealing the password or adding a password to these applications. The reason they did this was because it allowed them to launder their traffic in with the good traffic. So if I'm downloading all mail every day to classify it, then inserting a little bit more read activity into that stream to go and download, a particular person's mail is relatively lightweight. So, this is kind of what the attack looked like to us at the beginning. But as we got into it, what we found was that at every level, the attacker was going after trust relationships. They were compromising machines and exfiltrating tokens. They were compromising the network, the kind of the classic zero trust thing, which is don't overtrust your on-prem network. But the attacker was pervasive, and the path they took was different in each case. And importantly, you can start to think of this like water, that if there's a hole in the ship, the water will find its way in. And zero trust as a philosophy held and was extremely beneficial to customers that adopted it. And I personally worked several of the evictions and investigations. But every gap was exploited, right? And so I think you get into this model where you start to think about, this is like water entering a ship, right? If you can't make sure that your ship is leak proof, you better be getting good at bailing, right? One or the other had better be true if you're going out into the open ocean. So, I want to finish up with this question of like, how do we protect the root of trust? We need to protect the roots of trust as an identity industry, right? We need to be thinking about this. And protecting the root of trust is not something that we can say, I think, in a world where companies like FireEye and, organizations like the US government were unable to effectively protect themselves from these attacks. We can't say as an industry, it's on you, go figure out how to plug the holes. There's a set of this work that is organizationally specific and hard. And there's a set of this work that the identity industry can take up the burden on. And it's all stuff that we're investing in and invested in, and we sort of welcome participation on. But ultimately, I think it comes back to this question of, how do we apply zero trust principles within the identity infrastructure itself, right? If we talk about verify explicitly, what are we doing to share data with each other, to understand the context of requests? What are we doing for threat sharing? Protocols like RISC and CAPE that allow us to share data between parties are really key, right? What are we doing to encourage explicitly verifiable credentials? We all know passwords are crap, right? We know they're incredibly vulnerable, right? Are we doing enough as an industry to push for the end of passwords? Token binding. We know tokens can be lifted from one environment to another. We know that environments are compromised. Every user who runs as admin on their device is one mouse click away from infecting their device with malware that can compromise the entire organization's secrets. So token binding is a mandate. We have to drive harder for token binding. Many systems are configured by default fairly wide open because it makes for an easier user experience or an easier first-time experience going through the applications. But is that the right thing to do? Or should we move to a world where we actually encourage through our defaults a more restrictive environment that is closer to a least privilege access model, right? When we allow that malware that I talked about before to exfiltrate secrets, should we instead be saying that we expect secrets to be bound to hardware and push harder for that? That's been impossible in the past because of the lack of availability of good hardware, but trusted platform modules and HSMs and secure enclaves are more common now. And we are at, I think, a place where we can start saying we expect identity to be bound to hardware. Decentralized identity plays an important role. Can we get to a place where more of the claims about users are in the public eye, that we can verify them through things like, distributed ledgers and the blockchain? Continuous signal sharing we talked about before, but one thing that I think is important is in none of these situations did we come across a case where the software that we were working with, including our own, have been built with the assumption that the user would be compromised. So in all of these cases, users were left to build their own roadmaps for how do they recover trust in their environments. And this is a place where I think that we can do better as an industry. So that's kind of my call to action is how do we think about applying zero trust principles within the industry? And as we work together, within our standards to get to a place where we can say, we are ready to help our customers protect the roots of trust. We got to restore trust in the ecosystem. It's going to be very much on the vendors of identity and the people who set the standards to make that happen. And with that, I'll pass back to Jeremy. Here's a few resources on the screen. If you want to read more about Soloragate, or reach out to me, there's some contact information.
Hey, Alex, thanks. That was really great. And I appreciate you taking the time to do all this today. We had one question that came in during that from Steve Wilson, who pointed out, we've had roots of trust in browsers. Those have been kind of easily subverted over time, but roots of trust that are protected in hardware can be widely distributed in things like secure elements, TPM, smart cards, SIMs. He wants to know your take on, what do you think of that type of distribution and protection as part of the solution?
Well, I think the way that I think about it in any event is that let's take token binding as an example, right? I want to make sure that the token that I'm issuing can only be played from the one machine. Because I'm worried about malware getting in and stealing that token, right? So if I'm going to protect token binding from that, then I want to go and create a cryptographic signature. So there's a private key that's personal to the device, and it signs the request both to the IDP and to the relying party so they can be compared. If that signature, if the signing material is in memory or on disk, then if I'm good enough to steal the token, I can steal the signing material. Right? If I can put it in the TPM, then I don't have that problem. But that's not a widely distributed secret. That's a local to that instance secret, right? Like that's a local to the device and the user secret. So I think that the key to that thing is we don't want to have secrets that essentially we create a burden where we can't revoke the secrets. Like crypto agility is a really important aspect of this. So as we design these systems, we have to think about secrets being fairly local in nature. Right. And then we can use attestation and such to make sure they're coming from the right places.
Well, I think the focus there, if I hear you, is, how do we shift from scalable attacks to one where you have to compromise an individual device? And, once you have physical possession, that's a whole different game.
Yeah. Although, I mean, again, and then the meta on this too is you have to move all of this up into the supply chain, right? How do we make sure that every part of the supply chain, the farther upstream you are, the more important it is you're applying these principles, right?
Yeah. Next question comes from Rajiv Dalakia, who asks, Alex, how do we get session management and federation to a hardware-based proof of possession mode like FIDO? What's going to need to change in our standards and infrastructure and practice to make that happen?
Well, so I think, without telegraphing too much, I think what we're looking for is this question of, can we empower the people that consume these relationships to require an attested root of trust, right? And that gets you an awfully long way. So if I can go to a cert authority and say, hey, should I trust this here signature? And the cert authority can go back and say, well, yep, that comes from a TPM that I have in fact deployed into my environment. Then I'm in a safer place, right? Again, this is, the turtles all the way down joke, right? Is like really applicable here, because even if I have a hardware bound certificate, unless I can validate that hardware isn't malware posing as hardware, because like system level malware, I can get between the operating system and the TPM, right? So I actually have to validate that the TPM that generated that thing is real and that it's either manufacturer attested or local ECA attested. So, the chaining becomes a problem unless we normalize it. We say, look, we're going to I think the first thing we have to do is give people the tools. So we're going to say, look, in the standards, we should be able to say, not only is this token bound, but the attestation authority is something that we can go find out and discover.
Thanks. And, speaking of giving people the tools, wanted to get your take. So token binding's been an area where there's been some debate for a couple of years. First, it seemed like everybody was in favor of it. I don't think Microsoft shifted from that, but one of the other big companies who we all work with in the space decided not to embed support for it in the browser a bit ago. Does this latest attack with SolarWinds change any of that dynamic, do you think? Does it increase the urgency to come back and revisit some of those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I believe it does. Although, like as you said, we never wavered. Like we always believed this was, this was an inevitable step that we were going to hit. The fact that the attacker used token theft as part of their TTPs makes it, I think, something. We see that any successful attack has copycats, right? So you think about like NotPetya, now the total prevalence of ransomware, right? That those things, they echo out. And so I think at this point the clock is ticking on token binding. There are legitimate reasons that token binding has been slow to be adopted. The biggest one being that if you can't bind the secret to hardware, why bother? Which has been a part of the argument. And then the other big problem is that many folks rely on break and inspect. And break and inspect protocols, TLS token binding, you can't break and inspect those packets. So the binding won't survive break and inspect. So there are issues that we need to work out as an industry. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that there's a mandate that we get there.
And since this is a policy-focused event, you held up the CIS advisor before, and I'll say one of the things I've been personally impressed by, and actually shooting out to a lot of my clients in this space, has been the alerts that both CISA and NSA have been putting out on this issue, along with yours, in terms of the things you've been writing from the Microsoft side with your team, in terms of guidance. It's been really helpful. Taking it up a level from what the agencies are doing on the response side, understanding, we had a keynote earlier today from Congressman Katko. There's probably some staff here from the Hill now paying attention. At a policy level, because this was a different kind of attack, not just on the authentication layer, but on the, as you pointed out, the root of trust, the administration layer of identity systems, are there any takeaways that people should be thinking about in terms of what government should be looking to do at a different level than they were maybe 3 months ago?
I think, it's challenging. The issue, the issue at some level is that I think encouragement is good. The issue here is that regulatory reactions are the norm, or standards are a natural response to major attacks. The trick is that I think the average CISO is in a real bind, right? Like, you have an advancing wave of attacks and you have an advancing wave of regulations, and in the middle, talent is incredibly hard to find. My team is hiring now aggressively, and literally I've changed my Twitter handle to Alex Weinert is hiring. And we're a company that's able to attract some pretty great talent usually, but even we find that like getting enough talent in to meet the need is hard. Imagine again, that law firm or that, restaurant chain or whatever, how do they get the talent they need to meet that regulatory requirement? And again, it becomes a thing where really as an industry, we have to winnow out all the things that we can do for you. Like asking the customer to figure out how to do all this token binding stuff, or to mitigate the fact that it's not there in the protocols, is a lot to ask of somebody whose primary job isn't cybersecurity, when even the cybersecurity experts weren't able to protect themselves against it. Yeah. Right. So I think we have to shift this focus into how do we help the common business, the common enterprise, the common school protect themselves. And I think that is going to fall to, the low level standards and implementations that we're doing as an industry.
No, I think that makes sense. And I think part of where I'm looking to is, how do we get more to security by default? We've collaborated before in the FIDO world where, FIDO is really different today than 5 years ago. Now it's embedded in your browser. It's embedded in your operating system. You don't have to bolt it on. You can turn it on.
Right.
And are there other things there that we'll need to look to, in the months ahead?
Yeah. Yeah. It's an amazing time. And we're in some sense really privileged to get to work on these problems. I think these are the problems. I think we saw through the pervasiveness of this attack, how critical identity infrastructure is, how critical our role in helping protect that infrastructure is. And so, we need to step up together, but it's an honor to be in a position to get to. So we're fortunate that way.
All right. Look, I know we've taken a lot of your time. I appreciate you coming to join us today. It's been a great discussion. And, thanks. I'll let you get back to things and have a great weekend.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.